This business meeting of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee will come to order. Today we are marking up S.J. Res. 10, a bill to repeal the 1991 and 2002 authorizations for the use of military force. Let me commend Senators Kaine and Young for their persistent leadership on this issue. I know that others as well have been interested, Senator Murphy, Senator Cardin. I'd also like to thank them for their patience in seeing this bill marked up, particularly since Senator Risch and I had agreed to a markup of this bill in June, soon after our House colleagues voted in favor of repealing the 2002 AUMF. I agreed to accommodate the request from Senators Romney and others of our colleagues on the Republican side to hold a classified briefing on the issue, as well as a public hearing of repealing the 2002 AUMF, because I believe that votes related to the use of force issues are weighty ones that no member of Congress should take lightly. And I am pleased that all members of this committee have had an opportunity to fully understand the reasons for and implications of this profoundly important bill. As I have made clear, I believe it would be a grave mistake if we do not act now to repeal the 1991 and 2002 AUMFs. As we heard very clearly from the administration yesterday, in testimony from the Deputy Secretary of State and two senior lawyers on this matter, repeal of these AUMFs will have no impact whatsoever on our operations or detention activities. There is no scenario under which the United States could or would need to use force for which the administration would rely on the 1991 or 2002 AUMFs. They either have the authority, in their view, under Article 2 of the Constitution, or the 2001 AUMF, or they would come back to Congress to ask for additional authority. And that is the way it should be. And that will help ensure that the 2002 AUMF is not abused by any future administration. To those who believe that repealing the 1991 and 2002 AUMFs would somehow demonstrate a lack of resolve in Iraq or in the Middle East more generally, I would again point out to you the comments made by our administration witnesses yesterday. Deputy Secretary Sherman stated clearly, quote, "The 2002 AUMF against Iraq has outlived its usefulness and should be repealed," close quote. She also noted that as a result of the United States' strategic partnership with Iraq, quote, "the United States is poised to have a different relationship with Iraq and in the Middle East. And rather than speak to weakness, this speaks to strength." I also point out to those colleagues who are concerned about this our current reality, which is that any U.S. troops currently in Iraq are there at the invitation of the Iraqi government. And let us be very clear, repealed or not, the 2002 AUMF does not authorize any military activity against Iran. And that is not to say that the United States will not or should not show resolve against Iran as it continues to threaten our people and our national security interests. But the 2002 AUMF provides no authority to do that. There is no longer any legitimate purpose for the 1991 or 2002 AUMFs, and the time has come for this committee to stop dealing in hypotheticals and to act responsibly. I'm grateful to the administration for being responsive to our requests for briefings and public hearing, and I look forward to a strong vote in support of S.J. Res. 10 today. Turning briefly to nominations, I'm pleased that we will be voting on a number of nominees today. Unfortunately, we again have a blanket holdover request for 7 newly noticed nominees. And I must say this is stretching the bounds of comedy, only to understand that there will be a 2 p.m. markup. So the only thing that is being done is, inconveniencing the members of the committee to come back at 2 p.m. to have a vote, a meeting that both the ranking member and I have set. If this continues, then I'll have a conversation with the ranking member about how we're going to pursue this, because this is beyond the pale. It is not what was meant. Purposes of holdover of a nominee was to get more information, to have questions answered, to get the administration to deal with those questions through the State Department. But blanket holdovers of all nominees that undermine the national interest and security of the United States. We have a holdover of the person who is supposed to be the head of our diplomatic security abroad, supposed to help us protect our people abroad. God forbid something happens while this holdover continues. I wouldn't want to be the person responsible for doing that. So we will have a meeting at 2. We have one more nominee that we will consider for this morning, which also will be held over, Chris Liu, to be the ambassador to UN for management and reform, and we'll apply the holdover to Liu and then take up his nomination with the others at 2 p.m. this afternoon. I'm not going to speak to each of these nominees right now, but I do want to say I believe they're all well qualified and deserving their nominations, and I look forward to their swift confirmations. I would also ask for unanimous consent to enter 9 letters of support that my office has received in support of the nomination of Secretary Kenneth Salazar to the hearing record. And due to COVID precautions, we will email the letters to the committee's clerk. Without objection, those letters shall be included. With that, let me recognize the distinguished ranking member for his remarks. Senator Risch.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to speak to the markup on the repeal of the AUMFs. I'm going to vote against this, and I want to say that we've spent a tremendous amount of time on this. The AUMF area of concern is something that many of us in this committee have spent a long, long time dealing with. This is really nibbling at the edge of what the real issues are with AUMF, and that is, of course, the tug between the first and the second branch of government as to who has what authority and what power. This doesn't do this, so that everybody understands that's really not what we're arguing about here. Virtually all of us have the same agreement as to what that should look like. The difficulty is putting it into writing, and I've seen dozens or more drafts of language to try to get us there, and we can't seem to get there. But speaking just to this, with all due respect to the chairman, I would disagree that this has no useful purpose. And I think that the purpose of this is to communicate our resolve in the region, and particularly as it affects Iran. And we spent the hearing that we had the other day with each party talking about what effect this will have. First of all, I'll be the first to concede that whether 2002 exists or doesn't exist, gets repealed or not get repealed, it will have zero effect on the decision by a chief executive, whether it's this one or another one, to take action that the chief executive thinks needs to be taken. I'll be the first to admit that it makes no difference whatsoever. So then we come down to messaging. And what we did was we argued at length about messaging, and everyone said, well, I think they're going to think this, and the fact of the matter is everybody's right. When it comes to the messaging, there are people that are going to look at this and say, aha, the U.S. is getting weak on the region. The U.S. is not committed, not keeping the same commitment it's had to the region. And there'll be others who will argue the other side. I frankly come down on this that there is just no reason to repeal it at this time that in any way endangers sending a message that we are committed to the region and committed to protecting our troops and American interests, and that we will do so. And I was delighted to hear the chairman say, and others say, who are going to vote the opposite on this, that they share the same view, that we are committed, regardless of how we vote on this. And I think that's a message I want loud and clear as long as we're messaging. I understand what the vote is here and where this thing's going to go, but I really believe that it would be a bad message to send as far as repealing this AUMF that gives even the slightest inclination to anyone that we're backing away from this. So for that reason, I'm going to vote no on that. I heard no reason whatsoever that we should repeal it, that it will make a difference we have laws and executive orders and everything else on the books that are hundreds of years old, that are totally stale, but that don't make a difference anymore. And I think that's where I come down on this. It can sit on the shelf just as well as not. Regarding the nominations, I want to say that I appreciate working with the chairman on that. I think we've worked together quite well on them. We have had an issue. And this doesn't affect your comments regarding the blanket hold, but as to what we're finding from the State Department is their answers are getting less and less responsive to the questions for the record, and that's the reason for the one hold that I asked to have this afternoon, and I appreciate the chairman understanding that. But I hope that this will message to the State Department that these aren't. They're getting handled more cavalierly than what they have in the past. And that's the reason why we are where we are with the one I'm holding over, and that is the first answers were wholly unresponsive and borderline insulting with the way they were answered. So they were sent back. We didn't get answers till 11 o'clock last night. So I don't feel really badly about holding over this afternoon, but hopefully the department will take this more seriously as we go forward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Well, I want to thank the ranking member for his collaborative and cooperative work with us on these nominations. And I agree with him that when we do questions for the record, certainly I expect, and I expect any member's questions for the record, to be fully answered, not to be vacant of any substance. So I respect the senator's desire to do that, and I appreciate him putting him on the agenda for this morning, and we'll honor your holdover until this afternoon. With that, first, since we have a majority, before we get to the legislation, unless there's a question on nominations, yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to have to leave for another markup, and I haven't really spoken to this, but I would like to just make the rationale for my vote public. I truly appreciate the delivered process here. I mean, I think that the secure briefings, the hearing, I think they were excellent. I ended this process really inclined to repeal these because I agree with both of you that they're really not necessary. But I think I was persuaded by just the bad timing here. The weakness that has been shown, whether it's acceding to Nord Stream 2, bugging out of Afghanistan, we're already seeing these atrocities occurring there. This looks bad, and we should be sending a signal of strength rather than weakness. So again, although I'm completely sympathetic with repealing these, this is a really bad time to do it, and I agree with Senator Risch. I mean, these things can sit on the shelf. That they do no harm, other than the fact by repealing them, I think, does harm. So again, I'm going to be voting no on this resolution as well, and I just appreciate the time to be able to state my rationale. Thank you.
Thank you. And other members will have the opportunity to speak to when we get to the legislation. But for now, since we have the appropriate quorum, without objection, we will now consider in block 2 foreign service officer promotion lists and 9 nominations that had previously been held over. They are PN 385-2 is modified, PN 357-2 is modified, Gentry Smith to be Assistant Secretary of State for Diplomatic Security, Monica Medina to be Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans, International Environment, and Scientific Affairs, Rena Bitter to be Assistant Secretary of State for Consular Affairs, Mark Napper to be Ambassador to Vietnam, Brian Nichols to be Assistant Secretary of State for the Western Hemisphere Affairs, Karen Donfrey to be Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, Mary Catherine Fee to be Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs and a member of the Board of Directors of the African Development Foundation, and Witkowski to be Assistant Secretary of State for Conflict Stabilization Operations and Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, and Ken Salazar to be Ambassador to Mexico. Would any members like to speak to these items before we vote? If not, I'll entertain a motion that these items be approved in block. So moved. Seconded. All those in favor will say aye. All those opposed will say no. The ayes have it, and the nominees are reported favorably to the Senate.
Mr. Chairman?
And yes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent Senator Rubio be recorded as a no on the fee nomination, please.
Senator Rubio will be recorded no on the fee nomination.
Mr. Chairman, I'd ask that I be recorded no on the Monica Medina nomination and on the Mary Catherine Fee nomination.
Senator Cruz will so be recorded on
Mr.
Medina and Fee.
Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to be recorded a no on both of those same
Senator
numbers.
Barrasso will be recorded a no as well on both of those, Medina and Fee. With that, the nominees are favorably reported to the Senate, as well as the Foreign Service Officer promotion list. We'll now turn to S.J. Res. 10. Without objection, we'll now consider S.J. Res. 10, a joint resolution to repeal the authorizations for the use of military force against Iraq. Are there any amendments or any member seeking recognition? Senator Cardin.
Mr. Chairman, I do have an amendment that I will offer but would not seek a vote. And I would ask that my amendment that was a second-degree amendment be considered as a first-degree amendment, but with the understanding that I'm not going to seek a vote on the amendment.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment, and I support the repeal of the 2002 and 1991 resolutions, and I applaud Senator Kane and Young for their extraordinary patience and leadership in regards to that resolution. My amendment, I'm not going to offer for two reasons. First, I don't think it would be approved, but secondly, if it got onto the resolution, it would make it more difficult for the resolution to pass, and I would like to see the resolution have the best opportunity to pass. And quite frankly, I was going to seek a vote on my amendment, which would put a sunset on the 2001 authorization, but a long delay before that would take effect in order for us to be able to pass a substitute or updated authorization. I must tell you, I've been impressed by the committee's process here. I think the classified briefing hearing was important, and I think yesterday's hearing was important. And I was impressed by the sincerity of the Biden administration, particularly Secretary Sherman's comments about her working with us to get a replacement resolution for the 2001. But I want to make a comment on that. If we leave it up to the decisions at state or defense, we will never get a resolution that I will support because I think it'll be a blank check. That's what they want. They want a blank check. They would just as soon to see the legislative branch of government take a pass on the authorization for force or the oversight of that authorization. And that's normal. I understand that. I do believe the Biden administration is sincere in working with us on a realistic authorization, and I have confidence that President Biden understands what he needs in order to keep America safe in regards to our fight against the terrorist groups in the Middle East. So I'm prepared to work with the Biden administration, but I must tell you, I think that we're going to have an extremely difficult time with the lawyers at defense and state as we look to replace the 2001 authorization. So I'm willing to give some time to the Biden administration to work with us and to come up with a resolution that we can support. I mentioned at yesterday's hearing we need to deal with the geographical aspects and whether there's further requirements for consent by Congress before additional actions are taken. What is the mission that we are trying to seek? Is there going to be a sunset on the new authorization? Those are issues that I think we have to talk about and come to agreement. And I hope we can do that with the Biden administration and reach a consensus here in our committee and in the Senate and the House. But I think that without imposing a sunset on the 2001, us reaching that point will be even more difficult. So I will introduce as a separate legislation, a separate resolution, a sunset of the 2001, but sufficient time for us to let this process reach a conclusion as to what substitute resolution should be considered. I think that puts the more direct interest by the Biden administration to come to an agreement with Congress on where we need to be. So for all those reasons, I will not press a vote today on that. I strongly support the resolution that's before us, but I do think if we're going to assert the role of Congress, if we listen to some of our discussions on the fear of repealing the 2002 resolution and the 91 resolution, we recognize that what we're doing is really saying that Congress will have no role in this, that we're going to let the executive branch make all the decisions here, and we're giving a blank check. That's not what was envisioned in our Constitution. That's not our responsibility. We need to take the responsibility for the introduction of troops on a more permanent basis. That's our responsibility to give that authorization. There's clearly adequate protection for the American people in regards to urgent use of military under Article 2. I think that's pretty clear. But I do believe we have to reassert our position, and it cries out for us to update the 2001. As the chairman has talked about the 2002 and the looking at the 91, it's clearly doesn't apply to today's circumstances. But I would point out the 2001 does not apply to the current situations. As Senator Paul pointed out in reading the 2001, read it. Read what it says. We're not using it today. The administration is using it today for force against entities that didn't exist in 2001, and we're not responsible for the attack of our country on September the 11th. And that's what it says specifically in the 2001 authorization. So we have a responsibility to update that, and I hope that we'll take advantage of that during this Congress. And I intend to offer legislation to give us that opportunity to have those discussions. And I really appreciate the chairman and ranking member making time available for us to deal with this most important issue.
Well, let me thank the senator for his sentiments and also for withholding today. And we look forward to working with the senator, the author of the resolution, along with Senator Young. Senator Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank you and the ranking member for this process and for accommodating the desire of our colleagues for the closed and public hearing before this vote. I especially want to thank Senator Young for his steadfast work as the co-sponsor of this bill. Let me humbly suggest 10 reasons why this is a good idea. Number one, the two AUMFs supporting military action to counter the malignant activity of an Iraq governed by Saddam Hussein were rendered unnecessary more than a decade ago when he was toppled and executed and a new government of Iraq was constituted. Second, Iraq is now a partner of the United States, and both nations want that relationship to continue, as was evidenced by the recent positive meeting between President Biden and Prime Minister Khatami. In the aftermath of war, we didn't maintain war authorizations against Germany or Japan or Vietnam. Instead, we worked to try to make partners and allies of them. And we're having success on that with Iraq, and I think we should try to continue on that path. Number three, the 91 and 02 Iraq AUMFs are not used as the legal basis for any current U.S. military activity, nor are they needed to justify the detention of even a single detainee now in U.S. custody. Fourth, the repeal of the AUMFs will have no effect on the U.S. ability to keep Americans safe. Fifth, the powers conferred on the President by Article 2 of the Constitution enable the President to undertake military action against any entity who poses a direct and imminent threat to the U.S. or to our possessions, territories, or armed forces, including the militias in Iraq and Syria. In addition, the 01 AUMF expands upon that power to undertake military action against non-state terrorist organizations who have a connection to al-Qaeda or ISIS. Sixth, Congresses of both parties have abdicated our responsibility regarding the power to declare war and allowed presidents of both parties to act unilaterally. Congressional action to repeal these authorizations will represent a step toward Congress taking its most solemn responsibility seriously. Seven, some members of Congress were here in 2002 and voted against the Iraq War. Anyone who voted against the war should have no trouble repealing these outdated authorizations. Eighth, some members of Congress have stated that knowing what we know now, the Iraq War was a mistake. Anyone who believes the Iraq War was a mistake should have no trouble repealing these outdated authorizations. Ninth, allowing outdated authorizations to persist in perpetuity invites the prospect of serious abuses in the future. And 10th, the Commander-in-Chief, who spent 36 years dealing with war powers issues as a member of this committee, supports the repeal of these authorizations. I ask this committee to send a clear and bipartisan message that a Congress that initiated military action against Iraq can also recognize the end of hostilities against Iraq. I urge the support of this bipartisan resolution.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Paul?
It's much easier to start a war than to end a war. I've been trying for over 10 years to bring an official end to the Iraq War. In 2011, I forced a vote on this. In 2013, I reintroduced it. In 2016, I reintroduced it. And as recently as 2017, I lost every time. I'm hoping I'll be on the winning side this time. But I think it's a win for the American people, and I don't accept that it's meaningless. I don't think it changes what a president does in immediate, sort of short-lived military actions. I think presidents will do what they're going to do in those cases. But this authorization authorized 170,000 people to go to Iraq, a big, large land war. That's still on the books. If it authorized it once, it would authorize it again. So I think the vote today is not meaningless and symbolic. It is to say that we do not give any president, Republican or Democrat, permission for a large land-scale land war in Iraq. We're taking away that permission. If you want to go back, come before the people. It's a big, important vote. We all say it's the most important vote. Well, let's take it back and make it part of the Senate. So I applaud the efforts of all those involved with this, and I'm a wholehearted yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Paul. As someone who voted against the Iraq War in 2002, I totally agree with you. Senator Young.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for how you've conducted these proceedings and this entire process. And I, of course, want to thank Senator Kaine for his longstanding leadership on this issue and other colleagues like Senator Paul, who've been strong voices for ensuring that in this, as it's been characterized, invitation to struggle, which is how some have characterized the constitutional allocation of war powers, Congress is struggling. We're asserting ourselves and our constitutional prerogatives. So hopefully this can be a successful reinitiation of that long history of Congress speaking with a loud voice on matters of war powers. All of America's 5 major declared wars ended by treaty, but not all of the more than 40 congressional authorizations for the use of military force have been repealed. The 91 and 02 AUMF against Iraq resolutions remain in force, even though their purpose has, by all accounts, been accomplished. These authorities authorized the Gulf War and military action against the government of Saddam Hussein, respectively, and repealing them would not affect, I think we all agree here again, would not affect the 2001 AUMF, the primary domestic statutory authority for prosecution of the war against al-Qaeda, the Taliban, ISIS, and associated forces. The 2001 AUMF is not what today's business meeting is about. Acquiescence in the area of war powers relieves Congress of the responsibility to decide whether to authorize war or repeal outdated authorizations at a time when the American people, the military, our allies, and enemies need to hear from Congress on issues of war and peace. Some of my colleagues are rightly concerned about the threat posed by Iran. I share that concern. However, I believe that the threat from Iran is so significant and so different from the wars since 9/11 or Saddam Hussein's Iraq that we must pass a new AUMF should the situation require it. Nothing about the 2002 AUMF or its repeal changes that fact. Those advocating for leaving 2002 in place as a means of deterring Iran, when that was in no way the intention of this authorization, would be building on past abuses and advocating for precisely the kind of expansion of war power authorities that ultimately makes Congress and this committee irrelevant. The Soleimani strike last January was carried out via the President's Article 2 powers to prevent an imminent attack. The 2002 AUMF was cited merely as a secondary authority, not the primary authorization. I candidly believe it shouldn't have been cited at all. Soleimani needed to be taken out, but this was not. This was another misapplication of the authority granted by Congress. I ask unanimous consent that an article that's helped by a scholar who's helped educate me on the issues of war powers in recent years, Charles Colley Stimson of the Heritage Foundation, entitled "Why Repealing the 1991 and 2002 Iraq War Authorizations is Sound Policy," be entered into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you.
Any other members seeking recognition or amendments? Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I call up my amendment, Cruz, first degree 1. Let me start by commending the authors of this resolution. I agree with what you're trying to do. I think it is important, number one, to reassert Congress's authority over war making. Far too many Congresses, both Republican and Democrat, have willingly abdicated our constitutional authority over declaring war and over supervising the conduct of war to the executive, and we have allowed executives, both Republicans and Democrats, far too much leeway in exercising the awesome might of calling into battle the U.S. Armed Forces. I also am one of those who has long believed that the Iraq War was a mistake, that the world was made more dangerous by going in and toppling a horrific dictator and leaving a power vacuum that allowed even more dangerous enemies of America to rise up. So the endeavors that we're doing today are endeavors I very much support. I am a critic of the endless wars we have been in, and I think we should be far more reluctant to use U.S. military force than we have been previously. That being said, this resolution is not being debated in a vacuum. It is instead being debated in the context of an administration that is exercising a hard pivot towards Iran, that has decided one of, if not its preeminent foreign policy objective, is to re-enter some variant of the Iran nuclear deal, which I believe was a catastrophic deal. And in furthering that endeavor, it has consistently been turning a blind eye to malign acts from Iran. In just 6 months, the Biden administration has revoked terrorism sanctions against Iran's terrorist proxies in Yemen. It has removed Iranian officials from sanctions. They have dialed back enforcement of oil sanctions, including violations related to the Chinese Communist Party. They have unlocked Iranian accounts worth billions of dollars to allow Iran to pay down its debts. They have repeatedly declined to respond to Iranian attacks against our troops, and they have not imposed even a single significant new sanctions. And Iran has noticed. I believe weakness is provocative and is an invitation to violence, and in this instance, that has proven true. We have seen in the opening weeks of this administration Iranian proxies in Hamas raining over 4,000 rockets down on Israel that I think was directly provoked by what they perceived to be weakness towards Iran. We have seen the Iranians attacking U.S. forces repeatedly and killing an American military contractor, a U.S. citizen. We have seen the Iranians try to conduct terrorism on U.S. soil, including sending a kidnap team to the United States of America to kidnap a U.S. terrorist, a U.S. journalist. We have seen them launch multiple attacks on our Arab allies. We have seen them launch multiple attacks on civilian vessels, including an attack on an Israeli citizen, and we've seen them kill citizens from two of our close allies, Britain and Romania. That pattern is significant and is concerning. Now, in the course of all of these debates, the administration and the advocates of this resolution have said, as Senator Young just said a minute ago, that the ability to respond to Iranian aggression is contained within Article 2. I agree with that as an abstract matter. All this amendment does is memorialize that in this resolution. So if that argument is in good faith and genuinely believed by the proponents of this resolution, my amendment should be something easily adopted by both sides. What I don't want to see is this resolution adopted, these AUMFs repealed, and I believe that's going to happen. The votes are clearly there to repeal them. I think that's a good thing. But what I don't want to see is 3 months, 6 months, 9 months from now, when the Iranians launch yet another attack on U.S. forces, when they murder soldiers or sailors or airmen or Marines, I don't want to see the argument put forth by the administration that our hands are tied now that the AUMF has been repealed. We need another AUMF so we can't act. What I don't want to see is if in some time in the future we discover Iran is on the verge of acquiring a nuclear weapon that could be used to take the lives of millions of Americans or millions of our close allies, I don't want to see the administration saying, well, Congress repealed these AUMFs, so we have no power to act to protect American lives. And so I accept and embrace the arguments put forth by the proponents of this resolution that Article 2 gives the Commander-in-Chief the authority to protect American troops in the battlefield and to act to protect our national security interests. This resolution simply memorializes that in the resolution, and I encourage members of both sides to vote for it.
Thank the Senator. This amendment describes the scope of the President's Article 2 authority in a way that I consider far too expansive. Under this amendment, we would be declaring that the President not only has inherent constitutional authority to use force to protect the nation from an attack or threat of an imminent attack, but also to protect against unspecified important national interests. With reference to the concerns about the Biden administration coming forth and saying, I don't have the authorities, in February and June of this year, using Article 2, the President has already struck at Iranian-backed military militias, so I don't think he's going to be hesitant to do that. Embracing such a sweeping claim of presidential authority to use force, including for the purposes of, quote, important national interests, which is an undefined category frequently invoked by the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel without any limiting principle, would represent a significant renunciation of Congress's own war powers prerogatives. The point of this exercise is to remove 2 outdated AUMFs from the books, not to endorse a further tilt towards the executive branch on the use of force issues. And for those reasons, I will oppose the Senator's amendment. Is there anyone else seeking recognition? Senator Markup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe that there are 2 things I have concern with here. One is the solidification of Article 2 power, and the second is essentially inserting an authorization into this resolution. I'm very struck that our second president, John Adams, was very concerned about the French seizing our commercial ships in 1797. And so he sought permission of Congress to respond, and Congress did not act. So in 1798, the following year, he again sought permission of Congress to act, and Congress did act in May of 1798. Our third president, Thomas Jefferson, was very concerned about our commercial ships being seized in the Mediterranean by the Bey, B-E-Y, the ruler of Tripoli. And so he sought permission from Congress, and Congress acted 2 months later to give him that authorization to use our forces to protect our commercial ships. In 1815, President Madison was very concerned about the Regency of Algeria seizing our commercial ships. So he sought congressional action to authorize the ability to respond, and Congress did grant that 2 weeks later. My point here is that in the early phase of the United States, there was great respect for our constitutional requirement for Congress to authorize the ability to use forces. It was very much understood that the Commander-in-Chief directed those forces subsequent to authorization by Congress. We have had a challenge in keeping that line in place, and we had presidents of both parties, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, that ignored the need for congressional authorization in Vietnam, led to the 1973 War Powers Act, that tried to strike an arrangement to be able to respond quickly to concerns about our national security, but still embed congressional authority. I'd say to my colleague from Texas that the right thing to do in regard to Iran is to arrange for this committee to have a debate over authorization, a full debate, because it's that important. It's not something that should be put in kind of through an amendment into a completely different bill. It merits a full examination by this committee, any use of force in that manner. And I also would caution that we not be parties to continuing to corrupt the U.S. Constitution by embedding and strengthening the idea that a president has power to act without congressional authorization, and certainly not something as broad as conducting and directing attacks in response to Iran without clear authorization from Congress.
Senator Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you put your finger on it, Mr. Chairman, when you referred to the language here, which says that the president has the ability to protect important national interests. The inherent vagueness of that term makes this amendment just completely unacceptable. We're having a markup of legislation, and thank you, Senator Kane and Senator Young and all who have worked on it, to try to reassert congressional authority, to reclaim our authority. Here, in this amendment, there would be an abdication of our authority. We would be saying to the president, any president, that they would just have the ability to protect important national interests, undefined, or defined only by the Office of Legal Counsel in the White House. So from my perspective, this is a very dangerous amendment. We need to absolutely give the attention to Iran that it deserves. This would be a much too casual and ultimately dangerous way to deal with that subject, especially if the goal is ultimately to ensure that the Congress asserts its powers under the Constitution. So I would urge a no vote on this amendment.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I would argue on the merits that it would be a terrible idea for this committee to authorize an open-ended war with Iran. But I would plead with my colleagues that even if you believe that is the right course for this committee to take, don't do it by sticking a whereas clause in the middle of a deauthorization of military force relative to 2002. This will sort of spin legal scholars in circles. I've read this 7 different times, and I'm not clear what it authorizes and what it doesn't. It certainly appears to be an open-ended, limitless authorization of war against Iran. But, man, if you're going to make this commitment as a body, we shouldn't be doing it in a whereas clause. It should be its own piece of legislation subject to significant hearing and discussion. So I'm ready for a conversation about how to better authorize the military actions that have taken place against Iranian-backed proxies in Iraq and other places. This is just a tremendously irresponsible way to do it.
Senator Cardin.
Yes, I also oppose the amendment, and I support the underlying resolution. As I said before, I voted against the 2002 authorization when I was in the House of Representatives, and I will vote to repeal it now. But I mentioned earlier the 2001, and the reason I mention that, look how 4 administrations have interpreted the language we put in the 2001 resolution. If we were to adopt the amendment, think about how this could be interpreted by administrations as basically a blank check to do whatever they want to without Congress's approval. We're taking Congress out of the equation. So I agree with my colleagues. We should be talking about the appropriate use of force in regards to the threat of Iran. It needs to be done as its own separate debate and its own separate deliberations, and I would encourage my colleagues to reject this amendment.
Does the senator seek a recorded vote or a voice vote?
I'd like a recorded vote, but I'd like a chance to respond to the arguments that have been made.
The senator will have that opportunity. First, let me recognize the ranking member, Senator.
Well, thank you. I'm going to be very brief on this. I'm going to vote for this, and the reason I'm voting for this is because of messaging. As I said, all we're talking about here is messaging, in my judgment. I would be very reluctant to vote for this if it wasn't simply a whereas that was added. A whereas clause has no legal effect whatsoever. And so if indeed we were going to adopt this as substance, as suggested by my good friends from the other side, I think this would take a lot more deliberation on our part, getting the lawyers in here and picking it apart word by word. But where it is a message in a whereas clause to Iran, I think if
Senator Cruz, you can sum up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, this is the second time in several weeks that members of this committee have presented two inherently contradictory arguments in response to amendments that were offered. A couple of weeks ago, I offered an amendment to our bill dealing with China forced labor, saying that the administration should not be able to import electric vehicles that were manufactured by Chinese slave labor in concentration camps. That was amended with Senator Hagerty's amendment to include solar panels. The arguments of members of this committee against that amendment were twofold. Number one, it was unnecessary, that the underlying bill prohibited it already. But number two, that if we added the amendment, it would be a poison pill and destroy the underlying legislation. Now, those two arguments can't both be correct. If it's unnecessary, it's not a poison pill. We're seeing the exact same argument style concerning this resolution. Multiple proponents of this resolution have said that nothing in the repeal of the AUMFs would constrain the ability of the Commander-in-Chief to defend our troops in the field, to act against Iran. Indeed, in the June 14th Statement of Administration Policy, the White House stated that, quote, the United States has no ongoing military activities that rely solely on the 2002 AUMF as a domestic legal basis, and repeal of the 2002 AUMF would likely have minimal impact on current military operations. Likewise, numerous proponents of the repeal have said this would not have constrained the ability of the U.S. government to go after General Soleimani. Again, Senator Young made that argument a few minutes ago. Yesterday in this hearing room, the Biden administration made that argument that you didn't need the AUMF, that Article 2 gave the authority to go after General Soleimani. I will point out the language that numerous Democratic senators have taken issue with is quoted verbatim from the order authorizing going after General Soleimani. It is memorializing those sentiments. If those sentiments are in fact what this committee believes, voting for this amendment should be easy. But I suspect those sentiments are not what the Biden administration believes and not what numerous members of this committee believes. When the previous administration went after General Soleimani and took out the world's most dangerous terrorist, numerous Democratic senators criticized that decision vociferously. And so now we've already seen just a few minutes ago, Senator Merkley argued, well, if we need to respond militarily to Iran, the administration should come to Congress and we should have a debate and consider whether to authorize it. Well, that argument is not consistent with the argument everyone else is saying that Article 2 gives them the power to do it already. And I'll tell you this, the Ayatollah is listening to this debate. Look, if this amendment is adopted, I will vote yes on the underlying resolution to repeal the AUMFs. I want to vote yes. If the amendment is not adopted, I'm going to be forced to vote no. Because the Ayatollah is listening to what's happening. We've been seeing him testing the Biden administration over and over and over again, escalating, raining rockets down on Israel, sending a kidnap team into the United States of America. That's a big damn deal. That is not the act of a friend. And when the Ayatollah hears Democratic senators say, even in the face of hostilities, the administration can't act unless they come back to Congress and we have an endless debate that never happens, I believe that will invite more aggression. I believe U.S. servicemen and women, their lives are jeopardized if the Ayatollah looks at this debate and concludes that the power of the American president is so limited that there will be no response to military aggression. I think we should be very reluctant to use military force, but that doesn't mean you ignore an attack on American citizens. That doesn't mean you fail to defend our servicemen and women, our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who are in harm's way. And when you telegraph that the commander-in-chief's hands are tied and he won't act even in the face of hostile aggression, you invite more hostile aggression and more American blood shed by the enemies of our nation. I know that none of us want to see that outcome.
I would just comment, then we'll call for a vote. I know the senator thinks that he is in the mindset of the President of the United States. The President of the United States in February and June took action, which some members here have concerns about, but nonetheless took action under his Article 2 powers to attack Iranian-backed militias. I think he sent a very clear message to Iran. Don't mess with us. So I am not of the belief that the President of the United States, if he felt there was a threat by Iran that was imminent or, in fact, did something, that he would not necessarily wait for Congress. We may disagree. Some of us may disagree that he should come to Congress. But the suggestion that he is neutered by this debate or this amendment, I should say, or this resolution, is far from the President's actions to date. So on that, the Senator has asked for a recorded vote, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Carden?
No.
Mr. Shaheen?
No.
Mr. Coons? No. Mr. Murphy?
No.
Mr. Kane?
No.
Mr. Markey?
No?
Mr. Merkley? No by proxy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Van Hollen? No. Mr. Risch?
Aye.
Mr. Rubio? Aye by proxy.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Romney? Aye. Mr. Portman? Aye by proxy.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Paul? No. Mr. Young? No. Mr. Barrasso? Aye by proxy.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mr. Rounds? Aye. Mr. Haggerty?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman?
No. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the yeas are 9, the nays are 13.
And the amendment is not agreed to. Is there any other member seeking?
Mr. Chairman, may I seek recognition?
Senator Haggard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask to call up Haggerty first-degree amendments 1, 2, and 3, and I also request unanimous consent for single en bloc consideration of these Haggerty first-degree amendments as modified by their respective Haggerty second-degree amendments.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my proposed amendment would do 3 important things. First, it would repeal the 1991 and 2002 Saddam-era authorizations for the use of military force in Iraq. Second, it would provide modern and tailored authority for the President to protect our national security interests from continuing threats that are posed by terrorists and state sponsors of terrorism that operate in Iraq. And third, it will provide modern and tailored authority for the President to prevent and respond to attacks against Americans by terrorists and state sponsors of terrorism who are operating in Iraq. I'm offering this amendment at a time when the Biden administration is continuing to negotiate with Iran over how to revive the Iran nuclear deal, indeed, a deal that I believe to be fundamentally flawed. But even more broadly, the United States and our allies in the Middle East remain in a much longer struggle with Iran's terror-sponsoring regime. On that score, Iran is escalating its posture against us. It's repeatedly using terrorists, militants, rockets, and drones to attack Americans and our allies, and they've done so numerous times since January of 2021. As a lifelong businessman and a former diplomat, I'm loath to ever unilaterally take our own leverage off the table. It's bad negotiating strategy. I'm no fan of unilateral disarmament, particularly in light of an escalation like this. It's simple. If you take a card off the table, you better get something for it, or you should put another card back down on the table. President Trump cited the 2002 AUMF as one of 2 authorities used to justify his decision to eliminate General Soleimani, the Iran regime's terrorist-in-chief, who was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American troops in the Middle East. If we're going to repeal that AUMF, we should replace it with something to keep protecting Americans, especially as Iran-backed terrorists keep escalating attacks on Americans in the Middle East. I believe that the United States can strengthen its position if Congress gets up off the sidelines and provides the President with clear and defined authorities to protect Americans here. If we repeal the Iraq authorizations, we need to put something back on the table that is modern, that's tailored, and that's limited, so that we can message clearly to our allies in the Middle East, as well as to our adversaries like Iran, that the United States remains resolved to protect our nation's interest and, most of all, our people, including our diplomats and our troops. I believe that the legislative language that I proposed here can help us do just that, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Thank you.
I thank the Senator. I appreciate and share the Senator's concerns about protecting U.S. personnel and facilities from terrorist attacks. I believe his prior service as a chief of mission makes him keenly aware of the threats posed to our missions and outposts overseas. However, as we heard from our administration witnesses yesterday, they already believe they have sufficient authority under Article 2 of the Constitution and under the 2001 AUMF to defend our forces and facilities in Iraq from attack. S.J. Res. 10 is an effort to repeal 2 outdated AUMFs, but this amendment is part of a series of amendments that would transform the legislation into an authorization for the use of force. If passed, this amendment would constitute a significant delegation of war-making authority to the President against unspecified entities, implicitly including Iran, without limitations. So I agree with the Senator's sentiment that we need a modern and tailored AUMF, and I believe that repealing and replacing the 2001 AUMF is the best way to ensure that that scope of authority is appropriate. But I don't support converting this bill into an AUMF, and for that reason I urge my colleagues to vote no on this en bloc amendment. Senator Risch.
Mr. Chairman, fellow senators, I'm going to vote yes for this. I have to tell you that I'm pretty good at counting votes, so I know how this is going to come out. I would be very reluctant to vote yes on this if it was actually going to pass, and it's primarily because what this does is, as the chairman pointed out, something very significant in that it does authorize, and that's something that we've all learned over recent days, months, years, and for as long as I've been here, that this language really needs to be vetted, heard, both in a classified setting and in a public setting, as to what we're actually granting to the president. So that's serious business, and I'm not prepared that this language is what we need to do. But nonetheless, because I think messaging is so important with what we're doing, I'm going to vote yes on this just to send a message to Tehran.
Any other members? Senator Young.
Just an observation, Mr. Chairman, because I do know that so many Americans and world leaders follow these proceedings. It seems like we're placing more emphasis on the expressive power of one's vote than we are the actual text of language itself. And that just strikes me as a little bizarre, that one would be supportive of legislative language that they don't actually support because they think it sends a signal to the world that is different than the language itself. And so I'm perplexed. I'm perplexed because that's not how I make my decisions as it pertains to these votes. And I think it should lead to, and I'll invite my colleagues publicly, to a broader conversation about how we make these decisions. It may make me rethink, perhaps, how I cast my own votes. I doubt it. Thank you.
Does the Senator seek a recorded vote?
If I might respond, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Senator Haggerty.
I agree that this whole process is odd, Senator Young. And the oddest thing is the timing of it. The fact that the Biden administration would bring this up at a time when Iran is escalating its efforts against us, against American people, against our allies, against our troops in Iraq. The timing of this doesn't make sense, except in the context of negotiations that are taking place in Vienna right now. I don't want to see us deleverage at this point. From a business person's standpoint, you don't deleverage at a time when your opposition is escalating. That's why I'm trying to at least offer an ability to keep our leverage on the table. We should get something for this, and we should not unilaterally disarm. That's my concern. Thank you.
I would just note that I see no leverage in the 2002 authorization as it relates to a time in which Saddam Hussein was the enemy of the United States and the actions were taken, and that has taken place. There's a new government, and so I respectfully disagree with the senator. Does the senator seek a recorded vote, or does he take a vote short?
A recorded vote, please.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Pardon?
No.
Mrs. Shaheen?
No.
Mr. Coons?
No.
Mr. Murphy?
No.
Mr. Payne?
No.
Mr. Markey?
No?
Mr. Berkeley?
No by proxy.
Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Schatz? No. Mr. Von Holland? No. Mr. Risch?
Aye.
Mr. Rubio?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Romney? Aye. Mr. Portman? No by proxy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Paul? No. Mr. Young? No. Mr. Barrasso? Aye. Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mr. Rounds? No. Mr. Haggerty?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman?
No. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the yeas are 7, the nays are 15.
And the amendment is not agreed to. Is there any other member seeking recognition to offer an amendment? If not, is there a motion to approve S.J. Res. 10 as amended? So moved. So moved by Senator Cardin. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded. The motion has been made and seconded. The question is on the motion to approve S.J. Res. 10 as amended. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed will say no. The ayes have it. A majority of members present having voted in the affirmative, the ayes have it, and the legislation is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Cruz.
I ask that I be recorded as voting no.
Senator Cruz will be listed as recording.
Likewise, Mr. Chairman.
As will Senator Haggerty.
Mr. Chairman, vote
Senator
no.
Barrasso. Senator Rounds wants to be recorded no.
Myself, too.
Senator Risch wants to be recorded no. And Senator
Johnson wants to be
Senator Johnson and Senator Romney will be recorded as voting no. Now, before we close out, I would just ask, we have a holdover of a series of nominees that the ranking member and I had agreed to have this morning. We are having a 2 o'clock meeting that will carry them over, which means that the only result is that members will be inconvenienced in coming back at 2 o'clock. And I'm wondering, in light of that, is there a willingness just to bring those nominations that were before the committee for today's business meeting at this time for a vote?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cruz.
There is not, and I would note that the purpose of the holdover rule is being circumvented by the chairman's practice of holding multiple business meetings in a single day. And that practice is undermining the prerogatives of every member of this committee. So if the chairman wants to call another meeting later today to undermine the prerogatives of members of this committee, the chairman has the authority to do so, but I'm certainly not going to facilitate that change in how this committee operates.
For the senator's edification, holding a second business meeting is not a question of first instance here. We have done this many times before, and in fact, today's second business meeting had the concurrence of the ranking member. This completes the committee's business.
Mr. Chairman, before
Yes.
we do complete, I'd ask unanimous consent. Senator Johnson be recorded as a no on the Fee and Medina nominations, please.
On which one?
Fee and Medina. Senator Johnson.
Senator Johnson wants to be recorded no on Fee and Medina, and so he shall be recorded. That completes.
Mr. Chairman, may I be recorded as present in voting in support of the bill, of the resolution?
Present.
He voted in person.
Be recorded as an aye and
As
present
an
in
aye,
voting. Thank you.
Senator Merkley will be recorded aye and in person on the bill that was just passed. That completes the committee's business. I ask unanimous. Let me just finish this, and then I'm happy to recognize. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be authorized to make technical and conforming changes, and without objection, so ordered. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chair,
Senator Kane.
I was just curious about the vote because it was a voice vote, and I think there are 7 recorded noes, and now there's 1 recorded aye. And so I guess should all of the ayes be recorded ayes, or?
I'm happy to consider that if that's what the colleagues are.
So
all of those. Well, you know what? Let's do a recorded vote. This way, there is no confusion. Clerk will call the vote on S.J. Res. 10. for adoption.
Mr. Carter.
Aye.
Mrs. Shaheen.
Aye.
Mr. Coons. Aye. Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. Markey.
Aye.
Mr. Murphy.
Absent. Absent.
I by proxy.
Oh, the just desserts.
Senator Booker.
Mr. Schatz. Mr. Van Hollen. Aye. Mr. Risch.
No.
Mr. Rubio.
No by proxy.
Mr. Johnson.
No by proxy.
Mr. Romney. No. Mr. Portman.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Paul. Aye. Mr. Young. Aye. Mr. Barraza.
No.
Mr. Cruz.
No.
Mr. Rouse. No. Mr. Haggerty.
No.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 14, the nays are 8.
SJ Res is affirmatively passed and sent to the Senate for its full consideration. Senator Schatz.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that Senator Merkley be recorded as an aye in person.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered. And Senator Merkley owes you one. With that, the business meeting is adjourned.